I'm about to debunk some Islamophobia. Watch this. Look, before we get into the claim itself, because there's no shortage of Islamophobic claims, just picture this. Dude, it's the early 7th century, and we're in the rugged deserts of Saudi Arabia. It's just a mosaic of tribal alliances, caravan routes, and ancient pagan tradition that's been followed and studied through generations, through Arabic poems, with a large lack of literacy and understanding of what exactly the traditions are for. And into this world of believed ignorance and outright confusion steps in Muhammad ibn Abdullah, born around the year 570 in Mecca, who at age 40 begins receiving revelations, identifying God as Allah and himself as the final prophet, peace be upon him, his words then being transcribed into the Quran. Things were already difficult for Muhammad. This is the Wild West to the Wild West to the Wild West. Trying to understand the world that Muhammad lived in our day and age and lens, with any sort of judgment on overall morality, societal hegemony, would only bring negative thoughts. There was nothing aligned in that time, fully aligned with ours right now, in this region of the world, that we wouldn't be shocked and appalled by. These were the existential threats that Muhammad and his band of followers were facing in their early days, especially from the Semitic Quraysh tribe of Mecca, who controlled the Kaaba and the lucrative trade routes. The early Muslim community being outnumbered and out-resourced, being fiercely disciplined, with intense rigor and faith, just to survive in this area, while engaging in a series of defensive battles that shaped their survival, which brings us to the Islamophobic claim and the event it's attributed to. On 624 at the Battle of Badr, 313 Muslims were against 1,000, and the Prophet Muhammad received divine assurances of victory. One of these statements is well documented, captured by his companion Abu Huraira, and put into the Sahih al-Bukhari. This is the Hadith of Ru'ub, one of the Prophet's 5 privileges, in some narrations 6, that were granted to him by Allah. Now, this specific statement that Muhammad makes is used as an excuse by anti-Islamic people to claim that the Prophet Muhammad supported terrorism. They say the statement, "I have been made victorious with Ru'ub, cast into the hearts of my enemies, and the keys and treasures of the world were put into my hand." Now, in the English translation, Ru'ub, I'm so sorry for mispronouncing that, is translated as terror. And so Islamophobes essentially claim Muhammad is flat out saying that terrorism brings him treasures, but they just remove all context and clearly show they're illiterate. The Arabic term ru'ub does not carry indiscriminate civilian-centered violence. English connotations to the word terrorism do not apply here. When analyzing classic Arabic lexicons, it's interpreted far more accurately as an overwhelming sense of awe, or a paralysis of sorts, instilled by divine intervention into the hearts of the enemy combatants. It's very precise. It is clearly a divine projection of power, not just demoralizing opposing forces in conflict, but even before it, in order to erode the will to fight as well, with this divine aid manifesting in the Battle of Badr. And the supposed treasures that Muhammad is talking about also get mentioned that it never actually goes into his hands, but rather his followers and Allah, making that symbolic as well. Guys, the Hadith of Ru'ab was never a theological license to harm innocents, never one for random conquests, never one for indiscriminate violence. It was highly battlefield specific, tied exclusively to legitimate defense, specifically tied to divine sanctioning, before, during, and after military engagements, even used as a means to deter the military engagement. Combine that with the Prophet's own conduct, as recorded in the Hadith collections and the Sirah, emphasizing mercy towards non-combatants, children, and women, along with clergy and those who sought peace. The Ru'ab's overwhelming divine projection being used to minimize bloodshed, not to justify it, cherry-picking the misinterpreted word of terror to then distort Islamic military campaigns, and then later after Mahmud Ghazni, legitimize an identity that allows for that. It became absolutely warped later on. But this being made victorious with terror is not that, with the Prophet's words showing just how little people truly understand, or maybe choose not to. I'm about to debunk some Islamophobia. Watch this. Look, after already establishing a translation in part 1, it's time for me to turn my attention to the further Islamophobic claim that the Prophet Muhammad said to kill all non-believers, citing verse 9:5 of the Quran. But guess what? That's the middle sentence of a carefully worded 5-verse legal military declaration, which by the way is followed by a crystal clear command that completely dismantles this claim. But look, let's actually go back in time. It's around the year 631, it's the early Medinan period. The Muslims have endured years of persecution, defensive wars, and constant migration. They needed to be disciplined, along with being equally pragmatic and honorable, in order to survive in this landscape. So they would sign treaties with the tribes around them. They signed the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in the year 628 between the Prophet Muhammad and the Quraysh tribe of Mecca. Now the treaty was meant to guarantee 10 years of peace, but unfortunately it was broken when the Quraysh tribe helped armed an attack against one of the Muslims' allies. And so in a place like Arabia, at a time like that, you gotta respond. And yet the Muslims, even in this landscape, produced a very specific and time-bound military legal rules of engagement response. Look, in the Surah al-Tawbah, or repentance, which is chapter 9 of the Quran, I'm specifically referring to verses 1 through 16, have this formal declaration of rules of engagement. Verse 9:1 opens with surgical precision. Please excuse my pronunciation. Bara'atun min ilahi wa rasulihi illa ladina tahaddum mina al-mushrikin. Apologies for the pronunciation again. But this is basically transliterated to, this is a declaration of disassociation from Allah and His Messenger to those with whom you made a treaty among the polytheists. Now verse 9:2 grants these specific violators a 4-month grace period to travel safely anywhere in the land. No immediate violence, just fair warning. Then comes the explicit exemption in verse 9:4, except for those with whom you've made a treaty, who have not been deficient toward you, and have not supported anyone against you. Complete for them their treaty until their term has ended. The treaty keepers are protected. No loopholes, no blanket orders. Only after all these shields are placed does the dishonestly framed verse come up. Dishonestly framed by Islamophobes. Look, verse 9:5. But when the sacred months have passed, then kill the polytheists wherever you find them, capture them and besiege them, and sit and wait for them at every place of ambush. But if they should repent, establish prayer and give zakah. Let them go on their way. Indeed, Allah is forgiving and merciful. Guys, it refers directly to the violators, the ones who broke the treaty, and leaves zero ambiguity. And get this, to show you just how dishonestly framing these people are, look at verse 9:6. And if any one of the polytheists seeks your protection, then grant him protection so that he may hear the words of Allah. Then deliver him to his place of safety. That is because they are people who do not know. Despite the infantilization, observe the preciseness, safe passage, sanctuary, escort to security for any non-Muslim who asks. The sentence after the verse being cherry-picked as some universal kill command, further solidified by the monumental 9th to 10th century commentary, Tafsir al-Tabari, which plainly states on 9:5, it's referring to the polytheists who violated the treaty. Those who had not violated the treaties were excluded, and those who sought safety were to be given it, especially polytheists. Even going into the modern day, Dr. Khalid Abu el-Fadl, in his book The Great Theft, Wrestling Islam from the Extremists, one I highly recommend, he meticulously documents how this verse was used to create a perpetual holy war, a narrative that was rejected by the giants of the scholarship, but embraced by the brutes of the time. Al-Suyuti, al-Nawawi, amongst others, explicitly disputed. It's pure textual manipulation and dishonesty. Taking one specific statement of the rules of engagement of a very specific military situation, trying to apply that to everything. And I'm personally tired of the verse being used to try to perpetuate the claim that Islam's prophet actively ordered the killing of all non-Muslims, and that is some belief in Islam that can even remotely be proven. Because if you actually look at the text, you'll realize just how much these people didn't read. This will likely be my most dangerous and controversial video, but in part 3 I'm going to address the biggest Islamophobic attack, the Prophet's marriage. Watch this. Before I go into this, I really want to emphasize the controversy here, and really want to make my intent clear of trying to look at this honestly, with full awareness of the sacred placements that these real-life figures have to billions of people. I'm fully aware of this, and I'm trying to keep that in mind. Please do not misunderstand me or purposely try to make my points imprecise, because it is a really important point that should be properly addressed. This is my way of going over the most weaponized biographical detail in all of Islam. The marriage of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to Aisha. Look, I'm gonna go really in depth with this because it demands it. And with what I'm about to say, I'll definitely expand upon it. But the marriage of the Prophet Muhammad to Aisha can only be discussed honestly if three things are true at the same time. It is wrong by every modern legal and ethical standard. It was historically unremarkable of every civilization in the 7th century. And no Muslim today should attempt to use it as a personal precedent or any actions within society whatsoever. I'll go into why and how, but it's also important to note that the scholarly debate about Aisha's actual age is far more contested than any anti-Muslim activist will ever tell you. Got it? Okay, let's go to Arabia now. The introduction's already been made, go watch part 1. But the Prophet Muhammad, born around 570, received his first revelations around 610. The migration to Medina occurring in the year 622. Now, it's within this precise timeline that Aisha bint Abi Bakr entered the Prophet's household. Looking at the Hadiths, Sahih al-Bukhari 3896, and I believe Sahih Muslim 1422, give Aisha's age at the time of the marriage contract, the nikah, and listed as 6, and at consummation at 9. Now let's look at it. This is the primary narration, transmitted through Aisha herself, via Hisham ibn Urwa. This is the very source material scholars had pored over the centuries, with the ancient manuscripts preserving these accounts with meticulous care. There is later internal debate, but this is in the 20th century. So current internal historical scholarship, within certain Islamic scholarship, usually Western, the age is debated. Classical scholars engage deeply with this, so let's focus on that. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani in the Fath al-Bari noted that Aisha herself narrated the 6 and 9 ages, and this is the transmitted consensus. So let's just establish that. But now it's really time to look and realize just how much moral bearing we're inadvertently putting onto this. Let me explain. You have to be fair, right? Let's step back in the broader 7th century world. When we do that, it becomes historically unremarkable. In fact, marriage customs involved girls before puberty often, and betrothals even earlier. In fact, let's just look at the Muslims' main adversary, and Muhammad's own contemporary, the most powerful Christian ruler in the world, Emperor Heraclius. It's only fair, right? Yeah, well, guess what? Who'd married his niece Martina? The Visigothic law code of 654 permitted marriage with no minimum age. In 12th century England, Margaret Beaufort was married at age 12 to Edmund Tudor, gave birth at 13, experience that left her permanently disabled. In 14th century France, 6-year-old Isabella was married to English King Richard II. In the 15th century in Portugal, Beatrice of Portugal was married at 11. Now hold on. I am not making these as moral comparisons. I am not defending it. You have to look at this like historical context. Be academically mature and intellectually honest here, and look at the snapshots of the same era and beyond to see the global reality. If you want to be emotional listening to this, or understanding this about history, which is inevitable, have a form of grief rather than wanton shock. This is how all children in pre-modern societies were treated. When the environments and circumstances are like this. You gotta remember, in internal Islamic debate, both positions exist in the scholarly record. I'm referring to Aisha's classic age and the 20th century recalculation. But the modern legal ethical framework is so clear and remains firm. Under Islamic principles of maslaha, public benefit in preventing harm, this is wrong. The 1979 UN Convention on Children was ratified by every Muslim majority country on planet Earth. And when it comes to emulation, legal principle is clear. Classical scholars like al-Nawawi and Ibn Qudama explicitly categorize parts of the Prophet's personal conduct as qases, or specific to him, not applicable to others. Even within classical Islamic jurisprudence, the precedent for Islamic marriage was derived from general ethical principles, not from the biographical details of the Prophet's specific marriages. And any person today, Muslim or otherwise, who attempts to justify child marriage in reference to the Prophet's biography, is making both a legal error and a theological one. To understand this ethical evolution further, I recommend reading Woman and Gender in Islam by Leila Ahmed and Sharia by Dr. Wael Hallaq. But it brings us back to what I said in the start. In order to honestly discuss this, three things need to be simultaneously true. The age reported is what it is, and defensive denial of the numbers serves no one. It was historically normal across all 7th century civilizations, and performing outrage at 7th century Arabia, while simultaneously ignoring all European practices, is selective moral theater, and most importantly, it is wrong by every standard that matters today, ethically, legally, and in terms of Islamic ethical principles preventing harm. The anti-Muslim activist cites Aisha's age as evidence of Islam's moral failings that are supposedly unique, reciting a practice that was universal across all medieval civilizations. And the apologist who tries to revise the numbers to make them seem more comfortable is avoiding the harder and more honest answer. Yes, and by our behavior, it's wrong today, with classical scholars supporting this, and your own texts also supporting this. And that's the honest answer. First of all, thank you for the intellectually honest comment, and the opportunity for me to really flesh this out. I'm going to get to the very core of Islamic theology, and do my very best to try to make sense of all this. So let me start by answering your question directly. From what I can understand, yes, within Islam, he is still considered the perfect moral example. I'm referring to the Prophet. Uswa Hasana. What does that actually mean in classical jurisprudence? Well, scholars identified 3 factors of jurisprudence, and do this without dodging the moral character of the action. First, you gotta understand the difference between principles and customs. The core misunderstanding is based on an assumption that a perfect moral example means every single socio-cultural action he ever took must be copied by the literal end of time. But if we actually read Islamic jurisprudence, it does not teach that. In fact, scholars drew a hard line between eternal moral principles, talking justice, charity, and forbidding theft, and urf, which is the historical customs. Now, the Prophet's perfect example is found in his principles, just like how he applied justice and compassion within the material reality of his time. The second is the morality of the action itself. Now, the comment mentions that the action has to be inherently wrong then or now. But in Islamic legal theory, outside of universal sins like murder, the morality of social actions is judged by the presence of harm and their perception to it. Just look at the 7th century global reality. Compared to now, lifespans were dramatically shorter, puberty dictated adulthood, and societal survival relied on tribe alliances, being absolutely amplified in Arabia. This context gets blatantly ignored. The physiological and psychological harm of marriage, specifically early marriage as we perceive it today, was simply not a functional reality for any civilization of the time. Therefore, the act was not morally wrong then, because the socio-biological context was vastly different. Going into the third reason, which is why it's wrong today. And I think it's specifically important that I use Islamic law to establish this. Look, humanity clearly has changed. We actually have the concept of human development in psychology and societal structures. We have progression and identifiers that clearly allow us to recognize, if you're sane, that early marriage causes objective harm. And because the highest principle of Islamic law is the preservation of life and the prevention of harm, Islaha, al-Qasid al-Sharia, modern scholars are able to look at the practice and say it's not to be emulated using the very framework the Prophet left behind, with the Prophet having special permissions, or khases, excuse my pronunciation. But when I mention these special permissions unique to the Prophet, it's not a loophole to excuse bad behavior. It's actually a theological safeguard. It exists specifically so that Muslims don't try to universally emulate any highly specific or context-dependent aspects of his biography that would cause chaos or harm outside of his exact time, place, and standing. The idea that he was the perfect moral example can remain, because the system he established wasn't designed to freeze humanity in the 7th century. It was designed with legal mechanisms to adapt, prioritize human well-being, and prevent harm in 2026 at the same degree of effort in 622. But look, you might be saying, this is not the reality. There is definitely absolute literalism. But we need to look at this properly. In Eastern societies after Islam was established, there was pure tribal and regional authority over resources, post-Islam being reinforced by strict adherence to the Prophet and his teachings and his life in order to never go back into that old lifestyle again and fall back into this idea of ignorance, believing that is a way to maintain discipline, to ensure that never happens, which creates the atmosphere across societies that everything the Prophet did was right and true timelessly at all times, taking a small belief of superiority that was meant to be a guiding star as a fully literal, completely applied statement, and there is clear linguistic evidence against this. But with the way that the societies were set up, and tribalism was, and with the inclusion of the Islamic ideology, that's what resulted. Because when you actually read, classical scholars have always differentiated between the universal moral laws, the actions tied to 7th century customs, or actions entirely unique to the Prophet, being emphasized through 1400 years of Islamic jurisprudence. But now we go into the uncomfortable part. This is all great in theory, but what do we really see in real life? With claims of militant Islam and Islamic tyrants. Well, what makes someone an Islamic ruler? I mean the definition of Islamic ruler, because the identity is different to the actions of the Prophet and his companions. It's fair to say that Islamic religious conquest beyond the Rashidun Caliphate, those who were within the surrounding lands, could clearly have a disdain for the theology if it was forced upon them. But we often find that the answer is simply not as black and white, especially when understanding the trading influence and the merchant spread of Islam. But I'm going to make a statement. I absolutely condemn the actions of brutes like Mahmud of Ghazni, who literally hijacked the religion in order to plunder innocents and devotees of other religions and frame it as glorious jihad, becoming drunk from gold, creating waves of this false Islamic conquest. But here's the thing. At the exact same time, the people who try to emulate this first sultan also either don't know or deliberately have not been told that he threatened the caliph himself, their highest religious authority, along with massacring Muslims. To the later overzealous plunderers, if that knowledge has been left out or deliberately removed, how would they know? Especially when we said in the past that those Eastern governments and societies post-Islam, everything was contained, including theology. So within that world, why wouldn't any young growing warrior think they're operating in a very pious lens? It makes sense, doesn't it? This exact idiocy has led to events like 1398 in Delhi, along with the massacre of Chittorgarh, and the modern day situation that we're in right now. It literally creates a cesspool between any religion and this ambitious militant conquering Islam. Here's the thing, that in and of itself is a major oxymoron. In fact, ironically, the very thing that the Prophet tried to get away from, the creation of personal aesthetics and animated depictions of humanly features to prevent idolatry, ended up being used as banners of the very ideology the Prophet was trying to set in with those exact people in order to maintain discipline. Just to have a world where the people who claim it do massacres by the name of Allah and jihad and follow the same physical customs don't truly represent it. But once the sword is drawn and the blood is spilled and the religious statements yelled, who can tell the victims otherwise? What's the solution? This is what I propose. We have technology. We have the ability to cross-check more than anything and anyone else ever in time. We need to properly learn and observe all sides, aggressively put these points forward, and create an atmosphere where certain actions are outright shamed, or the main public perception is that it's stupid, futile, and backwards. If not then impossible. Only then will it work. There will still be some insane and desperate people. Brutes will always exist. And there does need to be a term that can be used for these people who aesthetically hijack the ideology and then cause harm on the ideology's reputation. Potentially even an Islamic term, you could refer to them as Dajjal, all of the false Islamic rulers. And there will still be some insane and desperate people out there who still want to support that or have so much inner damage from this cesspool cycle that they will continue to either hate other religion or fully stick with the superiority. Call it Stockholm Syndrome, call it insanity. We cannot save everyone. But with the right information, academic honesty, strength to make sure that honesty stays, and the ability to truly understand the snarky claims and the dishonestly framed claims in order to then blossom valuable interactions, kind of like the one that you gave me. Thank you. Okay, right when I thought I was done, I got another sharp pushback, and it deserves a direct answer. Again, the commenter is arguing that my explanation of the 7th century marriage of Aisha is just historical relativism, which is the idea that everything is morally okay as long as society is cool with it, even throwing in a pretty nice apocalypse hypothetical. So I'm going to break it down exactly why this misses the mark. First, we have to correct a massive category error here. You state, this boils down to, child marriage is not universally morally wrong if society doesn't perceive the harm. but I never argued about the perception of harm. I argued about the objective and material reality of harm. My point in the previous videos was not that 7th century Arabs simply didn't realize that child marriage was bad. My point was that given the brutal and socio-biological constraints of the time, where infant mortality is through the roof, life expectancy is low, and tribal alliances are the only shield to extinction, early marriage becomes a foundational mechanism for human survival. It's not about what society feels or perceives. Society is not at that point of luxury. It's about mathematical and biological realities of existing in late antiquity. Look, you included a hypothetical, and I want to address it head on. You asked if modern industrial society collapsed tomorrow, and we reverted to small tribe alliances with harsh conditions, just like 7th century Arabia, would child marriage be permissible again? And here's the thing. If we're looking at things like formulas, and the societal elemental composition progresses to a point where reproducing early is the only and absolute way to guarantee non-extinction, then obviously the moral calculus is going to shift. That moves from historical relativism to objective contextualism. It's weird and uncomfortable, and not something to think about, because we don't want to be in a situation like that. That is the purpose of us even being alive within society and advancing. To answer that question, if it regressed to that specific point, that's what would happen. But I'm being extremely literal there. Look, let me just give you an analogy. Is stealing universally morally wrong? Yes. But if you're starving to death in a famine and steal a loaf of bread to survive, and there's nothing else you can do, and everyone around is doing the same thing, would you be considered morally condemned? No. In fact, when looking at this hypothetical too, Islamic law actually suspends the punishment for theft during times of famine. But the universal principle that stealing is a violation of rights still remains true. But the material reality of imminent starvation overrides it because the preservation of life is a higher moral objective. Please keep in mind, this is all in that particular context, not at all applied to the real world right now. In terms of conduct for right now, I keep emphasizing this. This concept of the higher objectives of the law is found within Islamic jurisprudence, the Maqasid al-Sharia, with the ultimate goal of Islam being the preservation of life and the human lineage. This is the most plain way that I can explain this. At this point in time, perceiving it in a different way is more of a personal reflection rather than truly acknowledging the reality. So is the Prophet a perfect moral example? Well, Islamically, yes. His perfection lies specifically in how flawlessly he navigated the brutal and the objective reality of his time in order to establish eternal principles, justice, charity, and the eradication of infanticide. It's a complete theological and historical error to assume that being the perfect moral example means taking a 7th century survival mechanism or tradition stemmed from a survival mechanism, copy-pasting it in the 21st century, where those material conditions no longer exist, and contemplating those material conditions to exist now is not only counterproductive, but also slightly strange. But anyways, this is exactly why classical Islamic scholars categorize certain actions as qases, specific to the Prophet's context, and why modern Islamic legal frameworks restrict early marriage today, as shown in the UN. The principles are external, the material applications adapt to reality, and with proper context and understanding, you can clearly see this. This will be the last one. The whole 72 virgin promise is a complete fabrication. Let me explain. The promise of the 72 virgins, usually cited as an attack against Islam, is a crude sexual paradise promise and a specific recruitment tool used for violence. But there's two factual problems. The number 72 doesn't even appear in the Quran at all. And the single supposed hadith that has it is classified as weak by most classical hadith scholars. And also, excuse all of my pronunciation from this point forward, the Arabic word hur that gets rendered as virgins is actually a term for purity, referring to clarity of character, whose exact root, I checked, refer to the striking contrast between dark and white, not sexual inexperience. But look, let me show you my evidence. Now there's 4 specific locations in the Quran that uses hur al-ain: 4454, 5220, 5572, and 5622-23. Now the word hur comes from the root hur, meaning whiteness, purity, or extreme contrast between light and dark, like I said before. Now al-Raghib al-Asfahani, in his classical dictionary of Quranic vocabulary, the authoritative Mulfradat al-Faz al-Quran, defines hawra as one in whom the whiteness is extremely white, and the blackness extremely black, basically striking purity and clarity of character. The compound al-ain means eyes, so hur al-ain most literally means companions of eyes with striking purity or clarity. Clearly a description of spiritual character, no reference to sexual history. In fact, Quran 56:22-23 describes them as, excuse my pronunciation, kamtalalilu lu'ilil maknun, or like pearls kept in a shell, further emphasizing protection from harm, and with the previous context, emphasizing preciousness. And let's look at the number 72. While Sunan al-Tirmidhi 2687 is a single hadith claiming to contain it, and it's tagged by al-Tirmidhi himself as Hasan Gharib, or acceptable yet strange/isolated, which was his version of putting up the red flag in the chain of hadith analysis that there is a single unverified chain of transmission, with many classical hadith scholars classifying it as da'if, or weak. In fact, if we look at the Quran's actual paradise description, 76:15-22, 55:46-77, and even 56:15-40, emphasize rivers, gardens, fruits, shade, silk, and azwajun mutaharatun, which are referred to gender unspecified, purified companions, used in 225, 315, and 457 in the angelic sense, with Quran 4:124 explicitly stating that righteous men and women both enter paradise. Clearly, there's no gender asymmetry, and yet the trope was still used to motivate barbarian armies, acting like it was some sort of spiritual promise. But at every single level of actual textual analysis, the whole 72 virgin promise completely fails, with the Quran's promised paradise offering identical rewards to both male and female believers. And to be honest, if you lived your entire life with the belief of having 72 virgins, looking at it from a lens of carnal desire, upon the time of your death, then disrespectfully, heaven is not the place you're gonna go, bro. Allah, a word you've undoubtedly heard. How has it been perceived? Let me explain. Look, before we even go into 7th century Arabia, let's first look in between the 4th and 6th centuries, in order to understand the specific spiritual landscape where the Quran was revealed. Now, the Near East in the 6th century was experiencing a metaphysical civil war. You had the Byzantine Empire, or the Romans, ruling from Constantinople with the Chalcedonian formulation of the Christian Trinity, and they were at odds with the Miaphysite Christians, whose position held that Christ had a single nature, combining the divine and human, being the majority Christian population of Egypt, Ethiopia, and significant parts of Syria and Mesopotamia. Attempts by Constantinople to enforce Chalcedonian orthodoxy on these communities resulted in specific patterns of religious imperial persecution that left large populations of the Near East fully alienated from Byzantine authority and ready to accept any alternate order. Now, to the south was the kingdom of Himyar in Yemen, converting to Judaism in the 4th century, where the ruling class was Jewish and its population mixed. Now, the Himyarite Jewish theological tradition used the name al-Rahman, or the Compassionate One, as their primary divine name. It was distinct from the Syriac-Christian Allah. Now, the political competition between the Aksumite Christians of Ethiopia and the Jewish rulers of Yemen drew in the Sassanid Empire, which turned the southern portion of the Arabian Peninsula into a proxy battlefield. And the Arab tribes of Hejaz, the region containing Mecca and Medina, clearly weren't isolated from these environments, being vassals of either the Byzantine or the Sassanid networks, and operating between these two sections, where theological debates weren't unheard of. Which brings us to Allah. Well, guess what? It's not originally Arabic. It's actually Syriac-Aramaic in origin. See, the Syriac word Allah was the standard term used by Syriac-speaking Christians throughout the Near East for the God of the Bible, including the Trinitarian God of the Byzantine theological tradition. Now, the Zebed Inscription of 512, an inscription in Syriac, Greek, and Arabic, found in southern Syria predating the Quran by about a century, contains the Arabic word Allah, but in a Christian context, used by Arabic-speaking Christians to refer to the Christian God, referring to the God of the Trinity before the Islamic Revolution began. Meaning when the Quran uses the word Allah repeatedly, it wasn't introducing a new divine name to an audience that never heard it, it was deploying a word its primary audience already used, connecting in their minds to the monotheistic traditions of their neighbors and trading partners. If I had to put a specific theological resonance to it, it would be more so the God of the monotheists, rather than a new Arabian deity. I mean, just look at Surah 29:46. Our God and your God is one, using a shared linguistic vessel between multiple communities. I mean, there's concrete proof. I mean, just look at Surah 17, 110. Call him Allah or call him ar-Rahman. To him belong the best names. A legal proclamation of theological unification. It's not blending incompatible things. It's the assertion of common ground between traditions who shared the same monotheistic root, and whose differences were the product of centuries of Greek philosophical elaboration that the Quran classifies as gulu, or excess going beyond the monotheistic simplicity. I mean, just look at the Quran's focus on Abraham. He's the patriarch that's common to all three Semitic traditions. Before the elaborations of Judaism and Christianity, before the Mosaic Law and Creed, the Quran is asserting an ancient continuity. So now at this point, let's look at it. Syriac-Arabic word for God, employed in a moment of Near Eastern theological civil war, synthesizing Northern Syriac Christians, Southern Himyarite Jews, using the figure of Abraham as common ground, in a political environment where Arabian tribal confederacies were the vassals of two great empires, whose specific theological crisis was tearing the region apart. Now that's the context. Now let's look at the first phase of Islamic expansion, because now it's in the Levant, Egypt, Persia, and Central Asia. The early communities of Muslims were Arabic speakers, many from the same cultural environment as the Revelation's original audience. So the theological and legal debates that were happening in the early period were conducted by people who understood the Syriac-Arabic vocabulary, who could place each of the linguistic choices into specific historical context. But then a transformation came in the 9th century called the Anarchy of Samarra. From around 861 to 870, the Abbasid Caliphate became hostages of their own Turkic military guard, controlled by commanders from the Central Asian steppe who converted to Islam, but without the specific cultural and linguistic background of the Semitic and Iranian civilizations, the ones that actually transmitted the religion to them. This created a massive rupture. Arab-Persian ruling class, with direct cultural connections to the Revelation's context, replaced by a Turkic military class, with Islam entirely mediated through intermediaries, conducted in languages other than Arabic as a native tongue, fully filtered through the frameworks of steppe warrior culture. And that Turkic political model is different than the early Islamic model in one consequential way. The early Islamic political theory was rooted in the concept of the Ummah. This was a community of believers whose leadership was determined by community consultation and whose authority is grounded in the revelation and prophetic example. This was the model that the Quran articulated, the early caliphate implemented, with varying levels of success. But the Turkic political model was the steppe model of absolute kingship. The ruler was the supreme authority. Power is not derived from community consultation, but military dominance. And the theological formation of this authority, Zillallah, the shadow of God on earth, is borrowed directly from the Assyrian and Sassanid models of divine kingship that ironically, early Islamic revelation in principle had rejected. The concept of the Sultan being a universal monarch who was wearing Islamic theological vocabulary. I personally believe that the concept of submission within Islam was manipulated to mix within this framework to create a really mutated form of Islam. But what exactly does this mean? Well, the Hadith literature, the second most authoritative source of Islamic law after the Quran, was compiled almost entirely during or after this period. I mean, the Kutub al-Sitta, or the 6 Hadiths, compiled by al-Bukhari, from Bukhara, Uzbekistan, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, from Nishapur, Khorasan, Abu Dawud was from Eastern Iran, al-Tirmidhi was from Uzbekistan, al-Nasa'i was from Khorasan, and Ibn Majah was from northwestern Iran. Every single one of these guys is from the Khorasan Transoxiana region. None from Arabia, none from Syria, none from the original cultural and linguistic world where the original revelations were received. However, these scholars had rigorous methodology. The verification standards applied to the Hadith literature is one of the most sophisticated textual authentication systems in the pre-modern world. So scholarly integrity is not the issue. The issue is that they were applying these methodological standards to an oral tradition that has been transmitted across 2 to 3 centuries from multiple linguistic and cultural environments by narrators who themselves were distant from the theological context. A word or concept that had specific Syriac theological meaning, specifically in 7th century Arabia, carried a completely different resonance and transmitted through Persian intermediaries to Khorasani scholars, who themselves were operating in a world shaped by Turkic steppe culture. But let's apply this to something. When we look at the Hadith literature that addresses the treatment of non-Muslims in Islamic territory, declaring jihad, consequences of apostasy, treatment of women, that's where we really see the difference. A concept that made specific sense in the context of 7th century Arabia was compiled by scholars within Turkic military culture. The distinction between religious obligations and power structured wildly differently, unfortunately and ironically giving religious legitimacy to the sort of political coercion that the early revelations were actually trying to reform. And with the Islamic Golden Age, parts of this was set into stone, but also developed further. The Alawites, Druze, Ismailis, and Sufis represent the continuing traditions of Islamic esotericism and maintain the original Syriac synthesis, with the Mu'tazilite school insisting on rational interpretation. The Seljuk Sultan adopted the title of Shadow of God on Earth, and that stripping of the original Syriac nuance that would have kept certain terms and concepts at their original interpretive register resulted in massive suffering across many communities from the 10th to 13th centuries. Buddhist kingdoms of Khotan and Gandhara, Hindu kingdoms of northwestern India, the Christian communities of Armenia and the Byzantine frontier, the Zoroastrian and Sogdian communities of Central Asia, all encountered a Turkic militarized interpretation, implemented by Assyrian Sassanid absolute monarchy-style figures, whose legitimacy, provided by a legal interpretation, compiled 2 centuries and 2,000 miles from the conversation it was meaning to document. And we see that mutated Turkic militarized energy often. Just look at terrorism. But the word at the center of the world's most debated religious identity is a Syriac-Aramaic word used by Assyrian Christians for the God of the Trinity before the Quran was revealed, deployed by the Quran as a sophisticated bridge, and whose nuance was progressively lost as political power is being transferred to Turkic steppe warriors. So the next time you try to call terrorism Islamic, think about that. The anti-Muslim claim and attack of taqiyya is actually a haram act. Let me explain. See, a lot of Islamophobes claim that Muslims are Islamically permitted to lie to non-Muslims, specifically as a means of infiltration and deceit, is such a hollow attack when you actually read the text. Look, Quran 3:28 contains the permission, except when you guard yourselves against them out of danger, with the root meaning to protect, guard, or shield. The verse is talking about concealing your faith, specifically and restrictively, when facing genuine mortal danger. But what was the context behind this? What was the actual event that prompted this? Well, Amr ibn Yasir was being tortured by the Quraysh in Mecca. Watching his mother Sumayya being killed before him, he verbally renounced Islam to stop the torture. But the Prophet told him that he had done nothing wrong. His internal faith was still intact. The forced external statement being coercion and not apostasy. Look at Quran 16:106. Whoever disbelieves in Allah after his belief, except for one who is compelled, all his heart is secure in faith. Basically, you can't be forced to die for what you believe. If you can survive by a verbal statement, that does not change your internal conviction. Later being established in legal parameters. Al-Nawawi Sharh Sahih Muslim, taqiyya is only permitted under immediate threat of death or severe harm. Lying is prohibited in all other circumstances, never being allowed for general strategy, kind of like Nicodemism and the Jewish concept of anusim. With taqiyya clearly being developed to protect tortured minorities from being compelled to die for their faith. The Prophet applying it himself as a mercy provision. It was never created or used to be a deception license. And it's actually haram. The Quran doesn't permit you to hit women. You people just can't read. Let me explain. The attack that Islam allows for the hitting of women falls completely apart when we actually read the Quran. Let's start at 434. There's a word that I can't fully pronounce, adribuna, from the root drb. Now in Lane's Arabic English Lexicon, which is the standard reference compiled by Arabic dictionaries, drb occupies 12 columns. It includes to travel, darab fi al-ard, used in Quran 4:104, 494 to give an example, along with to give a parable, daraba matal, used in Quran 2:26, 14:24, 16:75, 18:45, 24:35, 36:78, 39:27, 43:17, 43:58, 59:21, 66:10, 66:11, all separate occurrences with zero physical connotation. To coin money, darb al-nukud, to impose, darb al-jizya, and to separate or withdraw, in Quran 43:5. Now the verse itself is referring to domestic estrangement, nushus, translated as discord, used in 4:128 applying to husbands. Here's a 3-stage prescription. Please excuse my pronunciation. Wa izuhuna, to gently counsel. Wa juruhuna, to draw in the sleeping place. And then the third term. Classical scholars, including al-Shafiqi and Ibn Qatir, interpreting the third stage as minimal or symbolic. The Prophet's own cousin Ibn Abbas, one of the most authoritative interpreters, if anything at all, Please strike with something no more consequential than a dental stick. The prophetic practice is even recorded. In Sahih Abu Dawud and Musnad Ahmad, he did not hit any of his wives, servants, or anyone with his hand, with some interpretation of the third stage being go away from them, citing Quran 43:5, but that's also in dispute, which just shows the meaning isn't settled. The stupid Islamophobic deployment of 434 strips an English translation away from an Arabic word, from its grammatical structure and prophetic context. But then again, Islamophobes, and people who also do put hands on their wives, both tend not to read as much. Time for me to defend against the scripturally dumbest and biggest Islamophobic attack. Claim Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a false prophet. Let me explain. Usually what tends to happen is you'll debate with people who are against Islam, operating from a place of ignorance, deliberately trying to impose religious dominance, while acting like they're being academically honest. Will reference portions of the Quran, try to act like the prophet basically proved himself to be a false prophet. Let's start with the first verse that they cite. Quran 69:44-46. And if he had fabricated against us some of the sayings, we would have him seized by the right hand, and we would have cut him from the aorta. It's indicating a divine oath. If any of the revelations were fabricated, God himself would have Muhammad killed by immediately severing his aorta. Now, after the siege of Khaybar, a Jewish woman, Zainab bint al-Harith, prepared a roasted sheep and poisoned it. She thought that the real prophet would get some sort of a divine indication that the meat was poisoned. Well, the prophet's companion, Bishr ibn al-Bara, ate the meat early and died. The Hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari 44:28, saying that Muhammad tasted the meat, felt the poison, and said, "Lift your hands, for it has informed me it is poisoned." He survived. He even asked her, "What made you do this?" She had done it to test if he was really a prophet, banking the prophethood on his knowledge of the poison if he didn't immediately die. And Muhammad lived on. So let's go to the prophet's death. Muslim 2190, the second hadith account of Bukhari 44:28, recording that the prophet in his final illness told Aisha, "I still feel the pain from the food I ate at Khaybar. Now I feel as if my aorta is being cut from the poison." Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani's Fath al-Bari looks at this as a confirmation of his prophethood. Be academically and contextually honest. The promise is talking about an immediate death of an aorta being severed, the poisoning situation testing prophethood, which according to the poisoner herself was supposed to kill immediately if it was a king, not a prophet, did not result in death. Years later, the pain felt from that specific episode on the prophet's deathbed fully explained his current situation in a way al-Mubarakpuri states as a martyr's death, dying as a shaheed. Which, guess what? If we're being academically honest, pairs the text together to form a confirmation. The divine protection from immediate death is the prophetic miracle, and the eventual martyrdom was a category Islam already assigned to him, that he fulfilled in his life. Now, whether or not you accept this reading, of course, depends on your religious alignment. But just looking at the text as words, there is a logically followed narrative, and completely denying that, or trying to reframe it as something that represents false prophethood, really just reveals a lack of knowledge. Just go read, dude.